Our second MSX episode starts with a Namco arcade classic, which kind of suffers from lack of exposure. Warp and Warp was originally made for the arcades in 1981, but it was originally only ported for 3 home systems. The MSX computers, obviously, and 2 of which were practically pre-MSX systems, the Casio PV-1000 and the Sword M5, both of which a significant minority of people have even heard about. Warp and Warp has the distinction of being a heavy influence on the original Bomberman game, but Warp and Warp itself takes some ideas from Wizard of Warp, for example. You're a monster hunter who warps between 2 areas. In the primary area, which is apparently called Space World, you shoot roaming enemies in a similar manner to Wizard of Warp. When the middle section starts flashing with the Japanese text saying Wabu, the middle area acts as a portal to the secondary area, the Maze World, in which the monsters are to be killed with time delay bombs, similarly to the yet-to-be-designed Bomberman. NES and Famicom gamers might have heard of the game Warp Man, which is a spiritual sequel to Warp and Warp, released in 1985, and can easily be found on pirate multicarts. It offers a simultaneous 2-player mode, which is a step off from the original game. But my exposure to Warp and Warp came through the MSX version sometime during the first wave of emulation mania, long before I learned of the existence of Warp Man. And it remains a firm favorite, which is why I recently bought it as a Bug Byte cassette version, which for some odd reason was published as Warp Warp outside of Japan. Here's a more recent find, but definitely the sort of game that I would have been crazy about back in the day. Actman is an old-school single-screen platformer with a twist. Instead of ladders, you get diagonally placed ropes to get from place to place. The idea is to pick up all the pieces of a puzzle from each level, which will take a few levels to complete, but while you do so, you need to fend off all sorts of creatures with weapons you pick up from certain sorts of containers in each level, but which you can only wield for a period of time. There's not all that much to Actman, but its simplicity and its own specific feel are what can get you hooked for a good while every now and then. And having said that, it's the sort of game you only play once or twice at a time before you discard it for something else. But it's always nice to come back to. In other words, a great nostalgia trip game. Sony wasn't particularly well known for being a games publisher in the 1980s, but Coaster Race is one of their hidden MSX gems. When I first came upon this game some 25 years ago, it didn't look to be more than a modification of Antarctic Adventure. But, of course, first impressions can be deceiving. That is to say, Coaster Race isn't completely unlike Antarctic Adventure. You still handle a vehicle of sorts in a behind-the-vehicle point of view and race against time on a winding road. As the name suggests, the roads here are much more winding than usual since the game takes place on some sort of roller coasters that don't seem to actually loop like they normally do. Each track has 4 checkpoints to reach, with the 4th being the goal, but no lap seems exactly similar to the others. From what I can tell, the game has 3 coasters that increase in difficulty as you make progress. The main hazard in the game is other cars, of which I've come across 2 kinds, the blacks that stay on their own lanes and the reds that usually zigzag a couple of times before settling on one lane before it's safe to pass them. The tracks themselves offer ups and downs, curves of various steepnesses, and even loops that get you going upside down, but oddly, it's impossible to fall down from them. Coaster Race doesn't come without problems, though. I'd say the game has been made for the wrong platform, since it tries too hard to be more than the MSX is known to be capable of, at least in 1986. The 3D effects, particularly when driving through curves, makes passing other cars practically a game of chance, since you can't actually see which lane the other cars are driving on until it's too late. Also, when going downhill, it's impossible to see anything coming at you, so the game has its fair share of cheap crashes. Regardless of all that, Coaster Race is an interesting game to get acquainted with, as it seems like it could well be one of the main influences behind Jeff Crammond's much more classic roller coaster racing game, Stunt Car Racer. It's not a game I revisit all that often, but it's always a fun challenge to return to. I get easily bored with classic form shoot 'em ups, so it's always fun to find something unexpected. Guardic from Compile was one such surprise when I was doing research for one of my unique games entries on the Finnish retro game comparison blog about 6 years ago. Prequel to the Guardian Legend on the NES, Guardic is, from all I know, an MSX exclusive, and it's a very different thing from its better-known sequel. Rather singularly for a shooter, Guardic approaches the genre with a choose-your-own-adventure aesthetic, if that makes any sense. Also, it looks more like a Breakout clone, such as Arkanoid, rather than any particular shooter game, but that has more to do with the confined space you play in than the actual action. But unlike in Breakout games, your spacecraft can move on the screen with similar freedom to how it does in Centipede and its sequels. Although the transitions between shooting scenes can go to any of the main 4 directions, all the shooting happens in a Centipede-like setting. The real trick in Guardic is how to use your ship's special abilities, all of which costs you some energy, which you don't have all that much to start with. Getting more energy for the weapons happens by picking up certain little round objects in some levels, which in their scarceness cause the game to become rather more strategic than you think. All of this makes Guardic a very interesting and unique shoot 'em up, and well worth having in your MSX collection. Our last game for today is a first-person adventure game that I used to read a lot about from a Finnish gaming magazine in the 1980s, but I didn't get to actually play it until the early 2000s. The Wreck from Electric Software was never meant to be a particularly flashy game, but it has an atmosphere that you rarely get to experience on an 8-bit adventure game from a first-person perspective. It's actually one half first-person shooter / dungeon crawler, and other half a puzzle adventure, but there's an added complexity to this with the game taking place underwater inside a shipwreck. The idea is to find a hidden treasure and find your way out, but the wreck's narrow hallways are inundated with hostile medusas, and having a finite amount of oxygen in your tank puts even more pressure into completing your quest in a timely fashion. All the clues to finding the treasure are hidden on walls, which you can only see on close inspection, but the random close inspecting can sometimes reward you with useful things, such as bonus oxygen. As you can see from the video, the game can be difficult to navigate because of the very uniform look of the wreck, so making a map, collecting all the clues on paper, and the old trial and error method of playing are the way to go here. I'm not sure if I would particularly recommend this game to anyone, but it does have its own special atmosphere to it.